She had 3 days before she had nowhere to sleep. Then a knock came at her door, not the apologetic kind. Three men stood in the hallway, and the one in the middle looked her in the eye and said it plainly. I don't love you, you don't love me, but my sons need someone who will not leave. She said yes. What that answer would cost and what it would build begins on a Tuesday in October 1873 with a piece of chalk in an empty blackboard. The courthouse in Colorado Springs smelled of candle wax and old wood and the particular anxiety of men who had come to watch something be decided. Eleanor sat near the front of that room at the table set aside for the respondent on an April morning in 1874, and she asked herself a question she had never permitted herself to ask out loud. Did she belong to this family? Not in the legal sense, not in the way the man across the aisle with the silver hair and the Boston accent was arguing. She meant it in the older sense, the way a woman belongs to the land she tends, the way a song belongs to the person who first learned it in the dark, from someone who is no longer there to sing it. The lawyer's voice was cold and precise. Your Honor, the marriage was arranged out of desperation. She had nowhere to go. He had children he could not manage. That is not a family. That is a transaction. A sound moved through the room, not quite agreement, not quite disagreement, the sound of people letting someone else decide for them, and Eleanor did not turn around. She looked straight ahead at the judge, at his white beard and his patient hands folded on the desk in front of him, and she kept very still. Because stillness, she had learned, was a kind of answer, but to understand why she sat in that room on that particular morning, why three men she had never met changed everything with a single knock on a boarding house door, you would need to go back 5 months. Back to a Tuesday afternoon in a small Colorado town where the mountains watched everything and said nothing. Back to a classroom with a blackboard that still held the alphabet in white chalk. Back to the beginning of the thing. The town of Silverstone, Colorado, sat at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, like something that had been set down in a hurry and never properly arranged. One main street, a general store, a church with a bell that worked on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays when the pastor was feeling optimistic. A boarding house run by a woman named Berta Hendricks, who believed that cold air built character and kept her windows cracked even in October. The school occupied a single room at the far end of the street. One door, 4 windows, a pot-belly stove that required coaxing every morning, and if you did not give it the right kind of attention at the right temperature, it would smoke and sulk and refuse to provide heat until nearly noon. And at the front of that room, a blackboard in which Eleanor Whitmore had written the alphabet in careful white chalk at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday in October. She had written it the same way she had written it every morning for 2 years. Not because the children did not know their letters yet, but because repetition is a form of kindness. Because there is comfort in the familiar shape of A, in the steady logic of B, in the quiet completion of C. Eleanor Whitmore was 24 years old. She stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and had honey-colored hair she pinned back every morning with 2 tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother. Her eyes were pale blue, the color of winter sky over the plains. Her hands were small and always slightly cold, even in summer, and they were ink-stained at the fingertips from grading exercises in the evenings. She had arrived in Silverstone 2 years earlier with a teaching certificate from a teacher's college in Denver, a carpet bag with everything she owned, and a particular kind of determination that some people called dignity and others called stubbornness, depending on how you felt about women who did not ask permission before deciding something. She had stayed because the work mattered, because there were boys in this town who had never held a book whose fathers had come west looking for silver and found only hard labor, and those boys needed someone to tell them that the world was larger than a mine shaft. Because there were girls who had never been told that their thinking was worth something, and they needed someone to sit with them until they understood that it was. She had stayed for 2 years, and she had loved the work, even the difficult parts, the cold mornings, the children who arrived without breakfast and could not concentrate, the parents who sometimes pulled their children out to work the land because there was no one else. She had loved the blackboard. She had loved the chalk between her fingers. She had loved the particular silence of a classroom when 20 small minds are all working at the same time, that industrious quiet that sounds like nothing and contains everything. By October of 1873, there were 5 children left. The mines had slowed to almost nothing. The silver operation to the east had shut its eastern shaft entirely. 30 families had left Silverstone in the previous month alone, loading wagons and heading north or west toward what they hoped would be better. The children who remained came to school out of habit or because their parents sent them out of the house to free up space for worry. 5 children in a room built for 20. Eleanor knew what that number meant before anyone told her. She was still standing at the blackboard reviewing the arithmetic she had left there from the previous afternoon when Councilman Whitfield knocked on the schoolhouse door shortly after noon. He was a tall man with good intentions and a permanent expression of mild apology, the face of a man who has spent his life delivering news he did not create and cannot change. He took his hat off before he came inside. He held it in both hands. He told her what she already knew. The school board had voted that morning. Enrollment was insufficient to justify the wages. She would be given through Sunday. He was very sorry. He truly was. Eleanor listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, she said 2 words. I understand. He left quickly. Men always left quickly when you refused to make it simple for them. She stood alone in the empty room for a long moment. Then she picked up the eraser and wiped the alphabet away. She did it slowly, starting at the beginning. At first, then B, then C. By the time she reached the end of the alphabet, the board was clean and gray and empty, and the room smelled of chalk dust, and there was no sound at all except the wind finding the gaps in the window frames. She walked back to the boarding house with her spine straight and her hands clasped in front of her, the way her mother had taught her to walk when circumstances were being unkind. 3 days after Sunday, she had no income and no lodging. Her parents had been gone for 4 years. She had no siblings, no husband, no land, no savings worth speaking of, because a school teacher in a dying mining town does not save money. She spends it on chalk and primer books and warm coats for children whose parents cannot manage. She had her teaching certificate, 2 carpet bags of possessions, and 3 days to figure out what came next. In her small room on the 2nd floor of Berta Hendricks's boarding house, she began to pack. The other tenants had already begun avoiding her eyes in the corridor. There is something about a woman who has lost her footing that reminds other people how close they are to their own edge. It was easier not to look. Eleanor understood this. She did not hold it against them. She folded her clothes with care. 3 dresses, 2 blouses, a wool skirt, 1 good coat starting to wear at the elbows. She packed her books. She packed the tortoiseshell combs in a small photograph of her parents taken before the hard years, in a Bible with her grandmother's name written on the inside cover in faded ink. She was folding the last dress when the first knock came. Councilman Whitfield again, hat in hand. Apologetic as promised by everything about him. He was sorry to be the one to tell her. Berta Hendricks needed the room by Saturday. There was someone else interested. He was truly, genuinely sorry. I understand, Eleanor said. He left. She stood with her back against the closed door and listened to his footsteps going down the stairs. Outside, the wind came off the mountains carrying autumn and cold stone and the particular loneliness of a place that is becoming a memory of itself. She had 3 days. After that, she had nothing a person could point to and call security. The boarding house settled into its evening sounds around her. Laughter from somewhere down the hall. A door closing. The oil lamp on her dresser needed trimming. The flame stuttered and threw uneven shadows. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her packed bags, and she allowed herself, for the first time since noon, to feel the full weight of it. Then the second knock came. This one was different. It did not rattle the door. It did not apologize. It was a knock that assumed the door would open, because this hand had never encountered a door that did not. Eleanor smoothed her dress with both palms. She breathed once. She stood and opened the door. The hallway seemed to get smaller. Three men stood outside her door, and it was not simply their size, though they were tall men, broad men, the kind of men that a certain kind of landscape produces over generations. It was something else, a quality that certain men carry without knowing it. They carry it the way a mountain carries snow, even in summer. A permanence, a gravity that has nothing to do with threat and everything to do with presence. The man in the center spoke first. Miss Whitmore. His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it, because for most of his life, the spaces he inhabited had been quiet enough that a low voice was sufficient. My name is Silas Calloway. These are my brothers, Reed and Cole. I would be grateful for a moment of your time. Silas Calloway was 35 years old, though he looked like a man who had lived those years fully and kept nothing in reserve. His face was made of strong angles, a square jaw, high cheekbones, a heavy brow, above eyes the color of amber. Not amber the word, amber the substance. That warm, dark, clear color that holds light inside itself and does not give it back. His hair was dark chestnut brown, cut without vanity, sun-streaked at the temples by years of outdoor work. His coat was dark and still held the dust of a long ride. His hands wrapped around the brim of his hat were large and calloused and completely steady. The man to his left, Reed Calloway, was 32, built along the same broad lines as his brother, but leaner in the face, the angles sharper. Dark blonde hair with the natural color variation of a man who works in all weathers. His eyes were gray-green, the color of cold moving water. The kind of eyes that assess and catalog and commit to nothing prematurely. His arms were crossed over his chest, not hostile exactly, simply closed. The posture of a man who had already decided something and was waiting to see if reality would confirm or contradict him. Cole Calloway, the youngest at 28, stood to Silas's right. He had the family height and the family bone structure, but something in his arrangement was different. His eyes were hazel warm and paying attention. His mouth sat naturally near a smile the way a creek sits naturally near its bank. Of the three, he was the only one who seemed entirely at ease with the strangeness of this moment. "It's late," Eleanor said. "It won't take long," Silas replied. No impatience in the words, no apology either. Simply the statement of a man who said what he meant and expected the world to receive it at face value. Eleanor looked at the three of them for a full moment. Then she stepped aside. They came in. The hallway was not designed for three men of that size, and they arranged themselves with the unconscious efficiency of brothers who have long since worked out the geometry of each other. Cole turned sideways past the dresser. Reed positioned himself near the door with the instinct of a man who prefers to know where exits are. Silas moved to the center of the narrow space and stood there looking at the packed bags on the bed, at the trimmed lamp, at the faded paper on the walls. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at a situation he intends to understand, not judge. "I heard about the school," he said. "News travels quickly. In small towns, yes." A silence settled. Eleanor crossed her arms, not in hostility, but because she had learned that a woman who stands with her arms loose at her sides in front of strangers looks like she is waiting for something to be done to her. She was not in the habit of waiting for things to be done to her. "If you've come to offer charity," she said, "I'll spare you the trouble." Something shifted in Silas Calloway's expression. Not offense, not amusement. Something that looked from where Eleanor stood like a reassessment. "I haven't," he said. "Then what?" He breathed in once, not stalling, gathering weight the way a man gathers himself before lifting something he knows is going to be heavy. "I need a mother for my sons," he said, "and you need a roof over your head." The words landed like cold water against skin. Eleanor stood very still. She waited for him to soften it, to walk it back, to add something that would make it lighter. He did none of those things. He looked at her with those amber eyes and waited while she processed it the way a man stands at the edge of a field and waits for it to tell him what it needs. "My boys," he continued. "Gideon is 9, Emmett is 7. Their mother passed 3 years ago. Since then, they have grown difficult, angry. They have driven off every person I have hired to care for them. And that concerns me because I have watched you. Reed made a sound. Half a word stopped before it formed. Silas did not acknowledge it. 2 years, he said. I have seen you stay after school to help children whose families cannot pay the fee. I saw you mend a coat without telling anyone. I have seen you handle a child in the middle of a rage without flinching, without raising your voice, without giving up. You saw what was underneath the trouble. Eleanor said nothing. She was listening. I think my sons need someone who will not give up on them, Silas said. Reed uncrossed his arms and took one step forward. Silas. Reed. 2 names, an entire conversation. Reed looked at Eleanor directly. His gray-green eyes were not cruel. They were the eyes of a man who has decided that honesty, however uncomfortable, is the only thing worth offering. We don't know you, he said. You are a stranger, and my brother wants to bring you into the house where his children live. I understand that's how it looks, Eleanor said. I'm telling you my position. I heard your position. A brief silence. Then Cole cleared his throat quietly in the way of a man who has learned that sometimes a door needs a gentle push from an unexpected angle. What my brother Silas means, Cole said, and his voice had a warmth his brothers lacked, not because he was less serious, but because he had found a way to carry seriousness without becoming its prisoner, is that he has thought about this for a long time. He doesn't move quickly on things that matter. Reed looked at the ceiling briefly. Eleanor looked at Silas. You're proposing marriage, she said. Yes. You don't love me. He did not hesitate. No. And I don't love you. I know that. The honesty of it was almost startling. So clean, so direct, so entirely without decoration that it actually steadied something in Eleanor's chest the way cold water steadies you when you've been running. She had braced for manipulation, for pity dressed as generosity, for the particular condescension of a powerful man doing a less fortunate woman a favor and expecting gratitude in the shape she offered. Instead, she had been given something she had not expected from a stranger standing in a boarding house hallway at night. The truth, plainly stated, no varnish, no apology for the absence of varnish. What would I have? She asked. Your own room, authority in the household, financial security, my name, respect. He said each item the way a careful man reads a contract clearly and without rushing. And the work itself, raising my sons. You speak of marriage like a contract. It would be one, he said, at least at first. Eleanor turned to the window. The mountains were dark shapes beyond the rain-streaked glass. The wind found the gap at the sill and touched her face. 3 days. After Sunday, she would have nowhere to sleep. Pride did not build fires. Pride did not buy bread. She knew this. Her grandmother had known this. You could carry your pride, and you could carry your dignity, but you could not confuse either of them with a plan. She turned back. If I mother your sons, she said, I will truly mother them. I will not be decorative. I will not be managed or overlooked. If I see something that needs to change, it changes. If I make a decision about those boys, it stands. Something crossed Silas Calloway's face then, not surprise, not challenge. The look of a man who has heard exactly what he was hoping to hear and is allowing himself the smallest possible acknowledgement of relief. I would expect nothing less, he said. She looked at Reed. His gray-green eyes were still watching her with that careful, unfinished assessment. He was not persuaded. He was not going to make this easy. He was going to watch and evaluate and decide for himself over time, which was not accommodation, but it was not cruelty either. It was the behavior of a man who takes the protection of his family seriously enough to be cautious about everything, including solutions. She could work with caution. She looked at Cole, who was watching her with something that was already in its early form beginning to look like trust. When she asked, Tonight, Silas said. The weather will worsen before morning. My carriage is outside. Eleanor looked at her pack bags, one trunk, two carpet bags, the entirety of 2 years of life, and it fit in 3 pieces of luggage. She thought about the blackboard, about the white chalk alphabet she had erased at noon, about the shape of A and the logic of B and the quiet completion of Z, about the 5 children who would go home tomorrow and find the schoolroom dark. She thought about 2 boys she had seen from a distance in this town. A tall 9-year-old who stood alone by fence posts on the edge of the road and looked at the horizon with the face of someone who has run out of questions to ask about where they are standing. A smaller boy she had watched one afternoon stop in the middle of the main street to move a dead sparrow out of the wagon ruts and into the grass, placing it there carefully with both hands, the way you move something that deserves better than where it ended up. Not wild children, not broken children, children who are hurting in the particular way that happens when the person who made the world make sense has gone and no one has helped them figure out how the world is supposed to make sense without her. She knew how to help with that. She had done it before in classrooms with children who came in carrying things too heavy for their small frames. She knew how to stand next to someone who was hurting and be steady and let them decide in their own time whether steadiness was something they could use. All right, she said. 2 words. They changed everything. Reed looked away toward the window. Cole let out a slow breath that he had apparently been holding. Silas Calloway held her gaze for a moment longer, and in those amber eyes she saw something move past too quickly to name something that was there, and then was not there the way light moves on water. He nodded once. Then he reached for her largest bag. She let him take it. Within the hour, Eleanor Whitmore walked out of Berta Hendricks's boarding house for the last time. She did not look back at the building as the carriage pulled away. Her mother had taught her that you could grieve a place or you could carry it with you, but you could not do both at once. She chose to carry it. In the carriage, the brothers arranged themselves with the efficiency of men who have long since negotiated the practical logistics of each other. Silas drove. Reed sat beside him on the boss and did not speak. Cole sat inside across from Eleanor, and the rain made its percussion on the carriage roof, and after several minutes he said quietly so that only she could hear above the weather, "He's a good man, Miss Whitmore. He just got out of the habit of showing it." Eleanor watched Silverstone disappear into the darkness and the rain. She had noticed something when boarding the carriage. As Silas reached across her to secure the door latch, the lamplight caught something at his cuff, briefly the edge of a watch chain or some tack he had forgotten to pocket, catching the light for a moment before he straightened and returned to the box. She did not look long enough to be certain what it was. She did not look long enough to be certain why she was looking. Some things made themselves known when they were ready. Calloway Ridge appeared through sheets of rain like a thing that had been waiting a long time to stop hiding. The main house was 2 stories of timber and mountain granite, wide and low and solid, built by someone who intended to stay in one place until the land itself gave out. A porch wrapped around 3 sides. Lanterns burned in the upper windows, throwing yellow warmth against the dark and the wet. There were outbuildings set back behind the house, a stable large enough for a dozen horses, a storage barn, a woodshed stacked high enough to outlast a long winter. Everything at Calloway Ridge said this was constructed by someone who understood what endurance required. But there was something else. Eleanor noticed it as the carriage stopped and she stepped down into the wet gravel of the yard. The structures were sound. The windows were clean. The porch was swept. The lamps were trimmed and burning. And yet the house felt like a room where someone had stopped breathing, and the room itself had not yet decided whether to acknowledge that or not. Silas opened the front door and stood aside. Eleanor went in first. The main hall was wide and clean, pine plank floors worn dark from years of use, a staircase rising toward the second floor, hooks along one wall for coats and hats, most of them occupied by things that smelled of horses and cold air, a rifle on a rack above the door, old and well-maintained, the smell of wood smoke and coffee and something else, something that had been present for so long it had become atmospheric, an absence so thoroughly established that it had taken on the quality of a presence. Two boys stood at the end of the hall. The older one was tall, for 9. He had his father's dark chestnut hair and the same amber eyes, though where Silas's eyes held a kind of settled stillness. This boy's eyes held something at war. He stood with his spine absolutely straight and his jaw set and his arms at his sides, the posture of a child who has decided that if he cannot feel safe, he will at minimum look prepared for whatever comes next. He was watching Eleanor the way a person watches an unfamiliar animal that has come into the yard, neither fleeing nor advancing, simply evaluating whether the situation required either. The younger boy stood half behind his brother, his shoulder pressed against the older boy's arm. He had curls falling forward over his forehead and eyes the warm, dark brown of river clay. He was small for 7, or perhaps he only seemed small because he was pressing himself into as little space as possible, as though the world had become a place with too much open area in it, and the best strategy was to reduce your own footprint. His fingers were hooked into the hem of his brother's shirt. Silas closed the door. The rain became a muffled sound against the windows. "Boys," he said. The word was calm, deliberate, the voice of a man who understood that in this particular moment, calm was the only thing he had to offer that would be useful. "This is Miss Whitmore." No one spoke. Then the older boy said, without inflection, without aggression, with only the flatness of something stated as fact, "She's not our teacher." "No," Silas said. "She's going to be your mother now." The word fell into the room the way a stone falls into still water, and the stillness after it was complete. The smaller boy Emmett pressed himself further behind his brother until only the side of his face and one wide dark eye were visible. The older one, Gideon, did not move a single muscle, but something happened in his face in the instant that followed. Something fast and very painful crossed his features like weather moving across open country, and then it was gone, retreated behind the jaw and the stillness and the amber eyes. Eleanor crouched down, not dramatically, not with any performance of warmth, simply enough to bring her face closer to the level of Gideon's eyes. She looked at him without flinching. She was not afraid of this boy. She was moved by him, which was an entirely different thing. "I'm not replacing anyone," she said. Her voice was quiet and level, no decoration in it, no practiced warmth, just the words. "Your mother belongs to you. She will always belong to you. I am simply here." Gideon Calloway looked at her with eyes that had spent 3 years learning how to measure things. "You won't last," he said, not a taunt, not hostility, a statement of what he knew to be true, established through evidence through 4 people before her who had come into this house and found reasons to leave it. He was not trying to wound her. He was simply telling her what the record showed. Eleanor held his gaze. "We'll see," she said, and she meant it, not as defiance, not as a promise she couldn't back, but as a genuine acknowledgement that neither of them knew yet what would happen, and the only honest thing she could offer him was the truth of that uncertainty. Silas showed her to her room that night, 2nd floor at the far end of the hallway, clean and adequate, a bed with a good mattress, a dresser, a window that looked out over the dark shapes of the mountains, a wash basin on the stand beside the door. She walked the length of the hallway as Silas pointed out where things were. The water closet, the linen cupboard, the door to the boys' room on the left, and then at the far end of the corridor, another door, closed. The handle was brass, smaller than you might expect. There was no dust on the handle, no dust anywhere on the door, which meant that someone touched it with some regularity, or at minimum looked at it closely enough to keep it clean. Silas walked past it without slowing his pace, without looking at it, without acknowledging that it existed the way you do not acknowledge the presence of a thing you have decided it costs too much to acknowledge. Eleanor noted the door. She noted the way he did not. She said nothing. That night she lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the rain against the window and thought about what she had done. She had walked out of one life and into another in the space of an evening, the way you cross a river at a narrow point, never entirely certain until you are across whether the current was going to take you. She was across. She was here. Whether that would prove to have been wisdom or desperation was a question that would take time to answer. In the kitchen the next morning, she found the thimble. It sat on the ledge above the sink, small and silver and worn smooth at the tip from years of a finger pressing it into place. The kind of thimble a woman keeps in her apron pocket and reaches for without thinking. The kind that stops being an object after long enough and becomes instead a habit and extension of the hand that uses it. It had not been placed there as decoration. It had been left there. Or left there and simply never moved, which is a different thing entirely. Eleanor did not touch it. She washed her hands in the cold water from the pitcher and looked at the thimble in the early light and understood that this house contained things that were still making sense of themselves and that she would need to be patient and careful and willing to let understanding come at its own pace. Cole came through the kitchen door a few minutes later, moving the way he moved through every space she had observed him in, at ease, comfortable taking up his allotted portion of the world without apology or performance. He poured himself coffee, looked at Eleanor, and said without preamble, "Reed will come around." "I'm not in a hurry," she said. "He's not against you. He's protecting." A pause. It was hard on all of us when Anne died. Anne, Eleanor looked at the thimble on the ledge. "That was her room," she said, not a question. "Yes." Cole looked into his coffee. "He's not ready to change anything in there. 3 years, and he's not ready. I don't think he knows how to be." He looked up at her. "She's still in this house. You'll feel her." Eleanor already did. "What was she like?" she asked. Cole thought about this the way he thought about things that mattered to him with genuine attention. "Patient," he said. "She could be very funny when she decided to be. She had a way of knowing things about people without being told. She paid attention to the right things." He paused. Gideon was 7 when she died, old enough to remember everything. Emmett was 4, old enough to miss her without knowing exactly what it is he's missing. Eleanor looked out the window. The storm had passed. The mountains were clear and enormous against a cold blue sky. "And Gideon?" she asked. "He holds things in," Cole said. "I mean, like his father, holds them in until they find their way out sideways." He drank the last of his coffee. He needs someone steady enough that he can afford to put some of it down. Someone who isn't going to leave when he tests them, which he will. "I know," Eleanor said. She was still looking at the silver thimble on the window ledge, and she was thinking about the locked door at the end of the hall, and she was thinking about 2 boys standing in a hallway in the lamplight, one who was already too old for his years, and one who was pressing himself into as small a space as he could fit. And she was thinking about what it meant to walk into a house like this and stay. Silas came through the kitchen without stopping. He poured coffee. At the back door, he paused. He looked at Eleanor. "The bevel on the front porch step is loose," he said. "I'll fix it today." Then he went out. Eleanor looked at Cole. Cole set his empty cup down on the counter and glanced toward the back door. "He hasn't fixed anything in this house," he said quietly, "that he didn't need a reason to fix." She thought about that for a long time. She had caught the loose edge of that step twice the previous evening and said nothing about it. And Silas Calloway had noticed. And he had no words for what he had noticed, or perhaps he had decided that words were insufficient for the purpose, so he was going to fix the step instead, because he had decided he had a reason to fix it now. This was the language of this house, not words. Things done, things built and repaired and maintained, things left on windowsills. She was going to have to learn to speak it. From upstairs came the sound of Gideon moving through the boys' room. His footsteps heavier than a 9-year-old's footsteps usually are, as though he was carrying something invisible that added weight to every step he took. He would test her. She knew this the way she knew the alphabet automatically from experience, from 2 years of learning to read the things children show you about themselves before they know you are paying attention. She knew what that jaw meant. She knew what that posture was guarding. She knew what it cost a child to look at a stranger and say out loud what he most feared, that she would leave, that she would be one more person who arrived and then was gone. She was not afraid of that test. She was ready for it. The thimble sat on the ledge in the morning light, small and silver and polished smooth by a hand she would never meet. The locked door waited at the far end of the hall, patient as everything in this house had learned to be. And in a townhouse on a Boston street, in a city 5 days' travel from Silverstone, Colorado, a woman named Victoria Hargrove sat at a writing desk and read a letter for the second time. The letter was brief. It told her that her brother-in-law, Silas Calloway, had taken a new wife, a school teacher from Silverstone, a woman nobody seemed to know much about. It told her that this had happened quickly and quietly, the way things happen in places where there are no witnesses who matter. Victoria Hargrove set the letter down on the desk. She looked at the window for a long time. She had not yet decided what she was going to do about this. But she was thinking about her sister's boys, about Gideon and Emmett, about what they deserved, and about what a woman in her position could do when she believed that a situation was not what it should be. She was thinking very carefully, and she had resources, and she had time, and she had the particular patience of a woman who has always believed that the law properly applied will eventually tell the truth. The front porch step was fixed by the time Eleanor came downstairs the next morning. She noticed it as she crossed the threshold to bring in the milk pail. The loose board that had caught her heel twice the previous evening sat flush now. New wood screws sunk clean into the timber. No gap, no movement. It had been done at some point before first light because she had heard no hammering during the night. Silas Calloway had risen before the household and fixed a step that no one had asked him about because he had seen her stumble and he had decided that was unacceptable, and that was the full extent of the conversation he had had with himself about the matter. She went back inside and poured coffee. The morning told her everything about the difficulty of what she had agreed to. Gideon came downstairs without speaking. He took his usual seat at the table, which placed him precisely as far from Eleanor as the table would permit, and he looked at the wall above the window and did not acknowledge her. When she set a plate of cornbread in front of him, he looked at it for a long moment, then stood up and went back upstairs without a word. His boots on the stairs were very deliberate, each step an announcement. Reed Calloway came through the kitchen without breaking stride. He poured himself coffee, scanned the room with those gray-green eyes, registered Eleanor's presence, the way you register the presence of furniture. You are not yet certain belongs in the room, and went out through the back door. Cole appeared 10 minutes later, rumpled and apparently cheerful in the way of a man who refuses to let the temperature of a room become his own temperature. He looked at the untouched plate of cornbread at Gideon's place, and then at Eleanor and said simply, "Give him time." He took the cornbread and ate it himself. And he left for me. Emmett appeared at the kitchen doorway, still in his sleeping clothes, holding a wooden horse by its tail. He looked at Eleanor with those wide, dark eyes, and then at the table, and then back at Eleanor, running the same calculation his brother had run, except in Emmett's case, the calculation took longer because he was 7 years old, and the variables were more confusing for him. Eleanor set a plate at his usual place and said nothing, and busied herself at the stove. After a long pause, she heard the sound of small feet crossing the floor. Then the sound of a chair being pulled back. Then silence, and then the small sound of a fork touching a plate. She did not turn around. She gave him the dignity of eating without being watched. When she did turn eventually with her own coffee in hand, Emmett was looking at the wooden horse he had placed on the table beside his plate. Not at her. That was fine. She had not expected him to look at her. She sat down at the far end of the table and drank her coffee and waited. Halfway through the plate, without lifting his eyes from the horse, Emmett pushed the crust of his cornbread to one side. It was the crust he clearly did not want. He pushed it precisely 1 inch from the rest of the food with the focus of a small person making a very deliberate administrative decision. Eleanor reached across and took the crust off his plate without comment and ate it herself. Emmett glanced up at her so quickly she nearly missed it and then looked back down at the horse. But something in his posture changed. Some small measure of bracing went out of his shoulders. She had learned over 2 years of teaching that the distance between a child who does not trust you and a child who decides to trust you is rarely covered in a single crossing. It is covered in small moments. A crust of bread, a coat mended without being asked, the right kind of silence at the right time. You build the bridge one plank at a time, never rushing, never drawing attention to the work. She had patience for that kind of work. She had less patience for Reed Calloway. Not because he was hostile. He was never exactly hostile, but he had a way of making his skepticism structural, the way you can feel the engineering of a building even when you cannot see its beams. He was present at every meal. He spoke when spoken to and sometimes when not spoken to, if the subject was the ranch or the cattle or some practical matter he had an opinion on. But he never addressed Eleanor directly except out of necessity, and when she spoke, he received it with the careful neutrality of a man attending a trial who has not yet decided which side he is on. Silas moved through the household at a frequency Eleanor had not yet learned to read. He was there and then not there. He appeared in doorways and then did not appear in them. He ate meals at the head of the table with an efficiency that suggested meals were something he had decided to be practical about rather than to enjoy. And then he was outside in the barn, or the fields, or somewhere along the fence lines that stretched to the edges of the property. In his absence, he left evidence of his attention. A stuck window latch that opened smoothly the morning after she had struggled with it. A broken spoke on the kitchen stool, replaced overnight. A new tin of lard on the pantry shelf when the old one was empty without her having mentioned it. He was learning the household through its objects, cataloging its needs, and attending to them in silence. She was doing the same. Cole moved between everyone like weather that insists on being pleasant regardless of the prevailing conditions. He laughed at small things. He talked to the horses by name and sometimes apparently carried on extended philosophical conversations with them while he worked. He found Eleanor useful in the kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with her being female and everything to do with the fact that she was efficient and did not require direction, which was the quality he valued most in a working partner. They developed a rhythm in the kitchen without discussing it. Gideon continued to test her with the consistency of a scientist running an experiment. He refused breakfast on the second morning. On the third morning, he ate, but left the table without returning his plate to the sink, which was, according to Cole, the established custom of the household and one that Silas enforced. Eleanor said nothing. She cleared the plate herself. She said nothing the next morning either when he did the same thing. In the morning after that. On the fifth morning, she heard the small shuffle of boots crossing to the sink and a plate being placed with careful quietness beside the wash basin, and she still said nothing, still did not acknowledge it because acknowledgement would have made it into something he had done for her, and he had not done it for her. He had done it because it was right. One evening, she found him outside at the edge of the property, standing at the fence line that looked out over the valley where the land fell away toward the creek, and the mountains rose enormous on the far side of the water. The light was going down behind the peaks, and the air had the particular stillness that comes to that kind of country at the end of the day when everything is exactly what it is without any pretense about it. She went and stood beside him, not close, 2 feet of fence rail between them. He didn't move. He was looking at the valley with the old man's expression that 9-year-olds sometimes wear when the weight of something they cannot name sits on them too heavily. She used to stand here, he said. Eleanor was very still. Mama, she said the land that looked like it went on forever. A pause. She liked that. She said it made her feel like time wasn't running out. Eleanor looked at the valley, the creek catching the last light, the mountains going dark at their feet while their peaks held the last of the color. She was right, Eleanor said. It does look that way. The boy said nothing, but he stayed there beside her while the light finished going, and she stayed beside him, and neither of them explained what they were doing to each other. Sometimes you share a piece of silence with a person, and that is more than adequate. It was later than she intended when she finally went inside. Silas was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with his back to the door, and there was a cup of coffee sitting at her usual place at the table, steam rising from it. Fresh. He said nothing. He did not turn around. He refilled his own cup from the pot. Eleanor sat down. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. The kitchen was quiet except for the small sounds of the house settling into the evening. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. She thought about the thimble on the window ledge. She looked at it in the lamplight, small silver worn smooth by a hand that was no longer here. She thought about the locked door at the end of the hall, about a woman who had stood at a fence line and felt that time was not running out. She understood now why the door stayed locked. Some absences are too large to put furniture in front of. She found the journal on a Thursday. Cole had mentioned that the storage shelf under the main staircase needed organizing, that there were things accumulated there that no one had looked at properly since before Anne died. And would Eleanor mind taking a look and deciding what could be sorted out? She said she would. She did not expect what was there. Most of it was practical. Old account ledgers, a crate of tools that had migrated from the workshop, a collection of pattern books for fabric cutting their covers faded, and at the back of the lowest shelf, pushed behind a set of stock records and half hidden by a folded canvas, a small book bound in dark brown leather. She knew from the size and weight of it what it was before she turned it over to read the corner. A. Calloway. She should have set it back. She knew this. She held it for a moment, aware of the exact nature of what she was holding, and she set it back. Then she picked it up again. She sat down on the floor of the hallway with her back against the staircase, and she opened it to a random page in the middle, and she read 3 lines, and then she could not stop. The handwriting was neat and slightly slanted, the hand of a woman who had been taught to write carefully and had continued to do so throughout her life as a matter of self-respect. The entries were not dramatic. That was what stayed with Eleanor, sitting on the cold floor with the book in her lap. The entries were not the writing of a woman making a record of significant events. They were the writing of a woman making a record of ordinary ones, because ordinary ones had mattered to her. April, 1870. The way Gideon had decided that morning that he wanted to learn to braid rope and had worked at it for 4 hours until he could do it without watching his hands. June 1870. Emmett's first real laugh, not the laugh of a baby discovering a sound, but the laugh of a person who has understood that something is genuinely funny, and how Silas had looked across the room when it happened, the expression on his face in that moment. November 1870. Anne had begun to understand that something was wrong with her health. She did not describe it clinically. She described it as a tiredness that went all the way down deeper than sleep could reach. She described telling Silas and then wishing she had not, because the expression on his face had cost her something. She described deciding afterward to be careful about what she let him see. Then a page that Eleanor read and had to stop and read again. The ink was slightly different on this page. The pressure of the pen was lighter, the way hands go light toward the end of things. It said, "If someone reads these pages after me, I ask only this: be patient with them. Not patient the way you are patient and with the difficult or the slow. Patient the way you are patient with the injured. They are not lacking love. They have only forgotten how to let it in. Silas will show you by what he builds and what he repairs. Reed will show you by what he watches over. Cole will show you by what he laughs at. And the boys. The boys will show you by how hard they push you away. That is how they were made, and how they were made is how I made them, and I would not change a thing." Eleanor sat on the floor for a long time. She was not aware that she was crying until she felt the cold on her face, the way tears cool when the room is this quiet. She did not cry loudly. She did not perform it. She simply sat there on the floor of the hallway with a dead woman's journal in her hands, and she let it happen because it deserved to happen. She looked up. Gideon stood at the top of the staircase. He was looking at her, at the journal in her hands, at her face. The expression on his was not readable in the ordinary sense. But she had learned in these days of learning him how to read past the surface of Gideon Calloway, the way you learn to read past the surface of still water to see what is moving below. What was moving below was very old and very young at the same time. He turned and went into his room. The door did not slam. It closed with the deliberate quiet of a child who has decided that quiet is a more powerful thing than noise. Eleanor sat for another moment. She closed the journal carefully and held it in both hands and thought about where to put it. She returned it to exactly where she had found it, pushed it back behind the canvas at the back of the shelf. Some things should stay where they are until someone is ready to move them. That evening, Gideon came down to the dinner table without being called. He sat in his usual seat. He received his plate without comment. He ate, no declaration, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. But something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure of the room and the quality of silence he brought with him. When he entered the way, weather shifts before a storm has yet produced anything visible in the sky. Eleanor did not look at him. She talked to Emmett about the book she had been reading to him the night before. She passed the bread to read without making a point of it. She asked Cole a question about the feed schedule and listened to the answer and asked a follow-up. Silas at the head of the table said nothing, but she felt him watching her the way you feel sunlight through a window, even when you have not turned toward it. 12 days after Eleanor came to Callaway Ridge, Emmett got sick. It was a minor thing, a chest cold, a sore throat, eyes that ached in the morning light. Not dangerous, but he was feverish by afternoon and miserable by evening. And when she brought him warm broth and the picture book he liked, she could see that the misery was only partly physical. He missed something in those moments, in the specific way that sick children miss things with a totality that is beyond their ability to articulate because it goes past words into a wordless place. Eleanor sat beside his bed. Outside, the storm that had been gathering over the mountains all day finally arrived. It came in the way Colorado storms come at that time of year, without particular apology, with full commitment. Lightning over the peaks, thunder rolling down through the valley, and long waves rain hard against the windows. Emmett pulled his blanket to his chin. Eleanor watched the lamplight move on the ceiling. "Mama used to do something," Emmett said. His voice was hoarse with the cold. "When there was a storm." She waited. "I don't remember what it was exactly, just kind of." He stopped. He was thinking about how to describe a thing that existed only as sensation, as a remembered quality of air. Like a song, but not a real song, just kind of a sound. He made a small movement with his head, looking for it, the way you look for something in a dark room by feel rather than by sight. "Could you try to show me?" she asked. He looked at her from under his blanket with those wide, dark eyes, testing the safety of the request, deciding. Then very softly he began to hum. It was not a complete thing. It was a fragment. 4 notes ascending, then 3 coming down, then something that curved and resolved, and then began again. Not a hymn, not a folk song, she recognized. Something that had been made specifically for the interior of this house, for the sound of rain against these particular windows, for 2 specific small boys in this specific room who needed to know that the storm was outside and they were inside, and the person who stood between them and the outside world was there, was present, was not going anywhere. Eleanor listened with her whole self. She memorized each note as it came, the way you memorize something that will matter later, committing it not just to the surface of the mind, but to somewhere deeper. She let him finish. She let the last note settle into the room. Then she began to hum it back to him. Not perfectly at first. She found her way into it, the way you find your way into a language that is not yours, by letting the sounds come before the meaning. She adjusted. She steadied. She found the place where it lived, and she stayed there and sang it gently into the lamplight while the storm did its work against the glass. Emmett's eyes went from cautious to wondering to gradually heavy-lidded. His fingers found her sleeve. She did not move. She sang the melody through twice, 3 times, adjusting her pace to the pace of his breathing, which was slowing, which was settling, which was becoming the breathing of a child who has decided to stop fighting the pull of sleep. When his fingers went slack, she kept humming for a while longer, quietly into the room. She did not know that Silas Calloway was standing in the hallway outside the door. She did not know that he had been there for some portion of those minutes, listening to his younger son's mother's melody, being sung by a woman who had never met her, who had learned it in real time from a 7-year-old child's fragile attempt to reach back towards something he had lost. She would find out later obliquely because Silas Calloway did not say things directly when he had a choice. She found out because in the morning, the loose board on the second step of the staircase, which she had been navigating around for days, had been repaired, and the window in her room that had been sticking since October opened smoothly for the first time when she tried it. And on the kitchen windowsill beside Anne's silver thimble sat a fresh bunch of dried sage from the root cellar, which had no reason to be beside a sewing thimble on a kitchen ledge and could only have been placed there deliberately. She stood in the kitchen, looking at the sage beside the thimble, and she understood. This was the language. She was getting better at reading it. The weeks that followed accumulated their own geography. Gideon began appearing in the doorway of the sitting room during the reading hour. She conducted each evening with Emmett standing at a studied distance, not participating, clearly listening. He did not pretend not to be listening. He simply maintained the fiction that listening was not the same as joining, and Eleanor respected the distinction. Cole began leaving her books on the kitchen table that he thought she might find useful dog-eared at sections about the ranch's land management and water rights, because he had decided she should understand the place she was living in. She read them. Reed continued his careful watch. He was always present, always attentive in the sideways manner of a man whose attention is a form of protection and who has not yet decided whether the thing in front of him requires protecting or protecting against. One evening, sitting at the dinner table after the boys had been excused, Silas looked up from his coffee and said without preamble, "Gideon asked me this afternoon if you were planning to leave in the spring." A silence. "What did you tell him?" Eleanor asked. "I told him that was not the plan." "Good," she said, "because it isn't." Silas looked at her for a moment with those amber eyes assessing something arriving at something. "He doesn't ask things like that," he said. "Not usually." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "It means he started caring about the answer." He said nothing else. He stood, took his cup to the sink, and went out. Eleanor sat at the empty table and thought about a boy who had spent 3 years being careful not to let himself start caring about answers, because answers had a way of becoming losses, and he had run out of capacity for that kind of thing. She thought about what it meant that he was asking again. That same week, Emmett asked her to braid the hair out of his face. It was a completely practical request. His curls had reached the point of obstruction. She sat him down in the kitchen light and worked through the front of it, carefully finding the natural division in the curls, coaxing it into a shape that would hold without pulling. When she was done, he looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window with a seriousness that was genuinely funny. Then he went outside to show Cole. Cole apparently had the correct response because she heard from the yard whatever Cole's version of a compliment was, and then Emmett's laughter, small and clear, carrying through the kitchen window. Then the letter came. It was the last week of November, a Tuesday with a hard frost on the ground and a sky so blue it looked like something artificial. The mail rider from Silverstone came up the ridge road, which he rarely did, which meant the letter had a delivery requirement that did not permit the ordinary approach of picking it up at the general store. Silas collected it at the door. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She heard the rider leave. She heard nothing further for several minutes. Then she heard Silas's footsteps crossing to the front porch, the door closing behind him. The sound of a man taking himself outside to receive difficult information in private. She stayed in the kitchen. When he came back inside, he passed through without stopping. He set the letter on the shelf beside the kitchen door, folded twice enveloped, face down. He poured coffee. He went back out through the back. Eleanor did not look at the letter for a long time. When she finally did, turning her head to see it clearly from where she stood, the return address on the back of the envelope was written in a hand that was decisive and clear: Victoria Hargrove, Boston, Massachusetts. She looked at the thimble on the windowsill. She looked at the letter. She did not touch it. She did not ask Silas about it that evening. She recognized what the atmosphere of the house told her, which was that this was information that would make itself fully known in its own time and that the wrong approach to it now could do damage to something that was only recently beginning cautiously to repair itself. Reed and Cole exchanged something at the dinner table that evening, a look that lasted less than a second and was nonetheless complete, the compressed communication of people who have known each other long enough that a glance carries the weight of a sentence. Eleanor ate her meal and spoke to the boys and let the letter sit where it was. It had Victoria Hargrove's name on it. That name meant nothing to her yet, but she had felt the quality of Silas's silence when he came back inside, and she had been a school teacher long enough to understand the difference between the silence of a man thinking through a problem and the silence of a man who has just recognized that a problem he thought was manageable has become considerably larger than he estimated. She would find out eventually. For now, there was supper to finish and a child with tangled curls waiting for his book. The spring came early that year and came badly. By the first week of March of 1874, 5 months after Eleanor had come to Callaway Ridge, the signs were already visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The snowpack on the upper peaks had been heavier than average through the winter, and now the temperature was rising faster than the valley had prepared for. The snow was not melting in the ordinary way. It was releasing all at once with the urgency of something that has been held too long and no longer trusts the thing holding it. Gideon told her at breakfast one morning, with the flat precision of a boy who had grown up absorbing the rhythms of this land through his boots and his father's conversations at the dinner table. The river is coming up. If it gets to the lower embankment, before the men reinforce it, we lose the pasture. Eleanor looked at him across the table. The matter-of-fact authority of it from a 9-year-old boy had a quality that was not quite sadness and not quite pride. It was something that existed between those two things. How bad could it get, she asked. Depends on how fast the North Slope releases. He was eating his breakfast with the methodical focus of a boy running calculations in the back of his head at the same time. If it's gradual, we manage it. If it goes all at once. He stopped, chewed, swallowed. We move the herd. Silas spent 3 days building towards something the particular quality of urgency that a man who manages a large operation carries when the operation is under natural threat. He was up before light. He was outside past dark. He spoke at meals only about practical things and only when necessary. On the 4th evening, he came in from the barn and told Eleanor, "I'm taking the hands down to the south bank tomorrow morning. Cole will be at the east fence. Reed stays here." He looked at her steadily. "I may not be back until morning." "We'll manage," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. In the morning, he was gone before she came downstairs. The house felt different with his absence, the way a room feels different when the largest piece of furniture has been moved. Not emptier exactly, more aware of its own dimensions. Reed came in for his coffee in his usual way and then stayed. This too was different. Reed's usual practice was to be wherever the practical work required him, which was generally not the house. That he was remaining close to the house without being asked communicated something that Eleanor filed away quietly. The day passed normally on the surface. She schooled the boys through their morning work. She cooked. She went out in the afternoon to check the chickens and noticed the quality of the air, that particular heaviness that precedes water arriving fast and in quantity. The creek at the bottom of the meadow was already higher than it had been that morning. By evening, the rain arrived. Not the tentative rain of ordinary weather, but the committed kind, the rain that has decided it is going to complete what it came to do and sees no reason to be gradual about it. It came in against the windows and the roof and the walls with a thoroughness that made the house feel both very solid and very small. Gideon paced. He went from the sitting room to the kitchen to the hallway and back, his footsteps finding the edge of Eleanor's awareness over and over with a rhythm that spoke the thing he was not saying. "He should have taken me," Gideon said the 3rd or 4th time he passed through the kitchen. "You're 9, Eleanor said. "I'm not a child." The way he said it carried all the genuine complexity of a boy who understood accurately that he was capable of more than his age suggested and found it unbearable to be contained by a number. "No," Eleanor said. She was not going to offer him a comfortable lie. But the river at flood strength in the dark is not manageable for any of us alone, and your father needs to focus on the herd. He can't do that and keep track of where you are. Gideon looked at her. The argument was not the one he could win with anger. He went upstairs. His footsteps on the stairs were very controlled. Emmett at the kitchen table with his picture book had not lifted his eyes during this exchange, but she noticed that his hand was not turning the pages. He was holding very still in the way of a child who has learned that stillness is how you get through the times when you cannot do anything useful. She sat down beside him. She did not put her arm around him. She sat close enough that he could feel the warmth of her if he wanted to, and she opened her own book and began to read. After a few minutes, almost imperceptibly, his shoulder pressed against hers. It was past midnight when she heard the sound from the barn. Not the sound of weather or of animals moving in the ordinary way of animals at night. The specific sound of something sudden and wrong, a horse giving a high cry, then hooves scrambling, then the particular sound of a large weight hitting something solid. She was out of bed and at the kitchen door with a lantern before she had thought it through. The rain was cold and immediate. It soaked through her coat in seconds. She crossed the yard with the lantern held high and pushed through the barn door. Reed Calloway was on the ground. He was on his side against the post of the nearest stall which had stopped his fall, but not before his right shoulder had taken the impact of it at a wrong angle. The horse that had thrown him was in the corner of the stall, settled now, regarding the situation with the equine combination of guilt and philosophical resignation. Reed was conscious. He was very pale. One hand was braced against the ground, and the other was working carefully at whether his shoulder would bear weight if he tried to use it. Eleanor set the lantern down and crouched beside him. "Can you tell me where it hurts?" she said. "I'm fine." "You're not. Tell me where." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that were accustomed to assessing situations from a position of authority. And the situation he was assessing now was that he was on the barn floor with a damaged shoulder being spoken to by a woman who had been in his household for 5 months and whose competence he had not yet finished evaluating. The conflict of this was visible. "Shoulder," he said, "right side." She moved his coat aside carefully and pressed 2 fingers to the joint. Methodical reading the information in the way his breath changed when she found the point of impact. Not dislocated, not broken, but the damage was real and would stiffen badly if he didn't get inside. "Can you stand?" "Well, yes." He stood. He did it with the careful deliberateness of a man who is not going to let a fall in a barn mean that he cannot stand up, which was about character and not about the actual condition of his shoulder. She let him do it. She positioned herself close enough to catch him if he needed it, and far enough back to not suggest that he did. He needed it once briefly in the doorway, and she took his left arm, and he let her, and then they were across the yard and into the kitchen. She sat him down at the table. She brought the lamp close. She found the medicine chest in the pantry, which she had located 2 weeks earlier, against exactly this kind of contingency. She worked through the bandaging with the focused quietness of someone who has done this kind of practical care before, not the frantic kind that involves too many words. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had clearly not been asleep. He was dressed. His eyes went from Reed to Eleanor to the bandaging materials and back to Reed. "I need to go down to the river," he said. Not to her, to Reed. "Uncle Reed, I need to go. He's down there." Reed looked at him. His voice when he spoke was not unkind. It was the voice of a man in pain, talking to a boy he loves in the honest way that people in pain have, with nothing left for performance. "Your father knows what he's doing," he said. "You don't know that." "I do know that. I've been watching him work that land for 30 years. He knows it. You know he knows it." Gideon looked at the door, then back at Reed. The war in him was very visible right now, the control he usually maintained stripped back by the hour in the rain, and the particular terror of loving someone who is out in weather that you cannot see from here. "What if he needs help?" he said. Eleanor straightened from her work. She looked at Gideon across the table. If he needs help, she said, there are 8 men with him who know that land and know the river and know how to work. You going out into the dark into a flooding creek bed helps none of them and forces one of them to stop what he is doing to find you. That is not the kind of help your father needs tonight. Gideon's jaw was very tight. She held his gaze. She did not soften it, and she did not apologize for it. She let it stand the way you let a difficult truth stand, without decoration. Stay, she said. That is what you can do that helps. He looked at her for a long moment. The anger in his face was real, and she did not ask it to be something else. Then he turned and went back upstairs. Reed across the table was watching her. You sound like her, he said. He was not looking at her directly. He was looking at the table at his hands resting there at the lamp flame. When she decided something was true, she said it that way. No room around it. Eleanor paused. She set the bandaging roll down. She sounds like someone worth knowing, she said carefully. Reed was quiet for a moment that lasted the length of several ordinary moments. She was, he said. She was the most patient person I ever knew, and I don't think she was born that way. I think she decided to be. Chose it every morning. He looked up finally. He looked at Eleanor with those gray-green eyes that were tired now and without their usual armor. She would have said, you're doing it right, for whatever that's worth. It was worth quite a great deal. Eleanor did not say this, but she thought it and she kept it. Silas came home before dawn. She heard the horses in the yard. She went to the door before he reached it. He was wet through mud on his coat from boot heel to chest, a cut along his right temple that had bled and dried and been ignored in the way of a man for whom that ranking of priorities is automatic. He was standing, which was its own information. He was standing the way a man stands when he has been working at capacity for 16 hours and still has resources left because he built himself to have resources left. Eleanor stepped back from the door. He came inside. She took his coat. She brought him to the kitchen chair that Reed had occupied an hour earlier, and she put the lamp close and she looked at the cut on his temple. Her hands were steady. It's not deep, she said. I know. She cleaned it. He sat without moving, without speaking, with the absolute stillness of a man who is allowing something to happen because resisting it would cost more than accepting it. When she was done, he said, we lost part of the lower pasture. The bank gave way at the south corner. But the herd is safe. She set the cloth down. That's what matters. He looked at her then, directly, the way he looked at the land when he was trying to understand what it was telling him. The amber eyes were tired and very present. He did not say anything, but something in his expression had moved from where it had been 5 months ago to somewhere else. She could not have described the geography of that movement precisely. She only knew that something had shifted in the space between them, in the mathematics of it, and that it had shifted in a direction that had not been there at the beginning. She stood up from the chair and went to make coffee. He watched her move through the kitchen, and then he looked at the window at the gray first light beginning beyond the glass. And the expression on his face was private, in the way that only some faces can manage, where something very large is happening, quietly contained, making itself known to no one except the person who was feeling it. 3 weeks after the flood, with the land still soft from the runoff, and the lower pasture marked by a line of dark sediment, where the bank had given Eleanor took the boys into Silverstone for supplies. It was the first time she had been back to the town since her wedding, if a brief civil proceeding in the Silverstone County Clerk's office 2 weeks after that first night counted as a wedding. She had not thought much about the return. She had been in these months absorbed in the work of the household, in the gradual work of the boys, and the complicated quiet of living among 3 men who had not yet decided precisely what she was to them. She was thinking about it now. She felt the eyes from the moment she stepped out of the wagon with Gideon and Emmett on the main street. Not the eyes of people she did not know. The eyes of people she did know, people she had worked alongside for 2 years, parents of children she had taught, members of a community she had served. The quality of those eyes was not warm. Berta Hendricks, who ran the boarding house where Eleanor had lived, was across the street and made no move to cross it. The wives outside the dry goods store spoke to each other and then separated their conversation from Eleanor's path, with the efficiency of women who have decided something and feel no need to revisit the decision. She heard the words she expected to hear, not loudly, not intending offense, because they did not understand that what they were saying could constitute offense. Just women talking about what they knew, which was a school teacher had lost her job and found a wealthy rancher's household to move into within a week, and that, as anyone could plainly see, was a particular kind of arithmetic. She kept walking. She kept her spine straight and her voice even when she spoke to the boys, and normal when she spoke to the clerk behind the counter at Wells General Store. Gideon was watching the women outside. He had ears that collected everything. On the ride home with the supplies loaded and Emmett occupied with a piece of penny candy he had been given at the store, Gideon said quietly, so only she could hear over the wheels on the road, "They're wrong about you." She looked at him. "What they're saying," he said, "it's wrong." She thought about how to answer this. She thought about the various things she could say that would be technically true and also comfortable and also slightly beside the point. "People form opinions about things they don't fully understand," she said. "That's not new and it isn't particular to us." "It's not fair." "No, it isn't." He was quiet for a stretch of road. "Then I told Billy Marsh last week that his mother should mind her own business." Eleanor pressed her lips together, briefly against the smile that wanted to happen. "That probably wasn't the most useful approach." He started it. She looked at the road ahead, the mountains, the afternoon light laying long and flat across the meadow grass. "Thank you," she said, "for meaning it, even if the delivery could use some work." He said nothing, but she heard the small sound of him settling back against the wagon seat, and she understood that something had been offered and received between them. The carriage came up the ridge road 4 days later. Eleanor was on the porch with a mending basket when she heard the wheels on the gravel. It was a type of carriage that Silverstone did not often see, two-horse well-appointed, with the particular cleanliness of something maintained by someone for whom appearances are a form of communication. It rolled to a stop in the yard with the finality of a statement. Silas came from the direction of the barn. He stopped when he saw the carriage. Something in his body changed in that moment, a subtle tightening, a shifting of posture that was barely perceptible, and told Eleanor everything she needed to know about the relationship between the man on the porch and whoever was in that carriage. The door opened. The woman who stepped down was tall and well-dressed in city clothes that had no business on a ranch road, a deep green traveling dress with a fitted jacket, gloves, the color of cream, a hat that cost more than a month of Eleanor's previous salary. She was perhaps 38, with a face that would have been called handsome in any room she entered, the face of a woman who understood the strategic dimensions of her own appearance and worked with them deliberately. Her gray eyes made a rapid and complete assessment of the yard, the house, the porch, and Eleanor in approximately 2 seconds. "Silas," she said, her voice carried from the yard to the porch with the ease of a woman accustomed to speaking in rooms that gave her their attention. "Victoria," he said. The name arrived in Eleanor's chest the way the name on the envelope had arrived. She did not move from her chair on the porch. She kept the mending basket in her lap. Victoria Hargrove's eyes came to rest on Eleanor with the quality of something deliberate and prepared. "So this is the replacement," she said. The words were not shouted. They were spoken at normal volume, which was worse because it suggested that she saw no reason to be careful about how they landed. She came across the yard with a measured step and looked up at Eleanor on the porch. "I am Victoria Hargrove," she said, "Anne's sister, the boy's aunt. I have come from Boston with my attorney to discuss the matter of my nephew's care." She said it the way you say something you have rehearsed sufficiently that it no longer feels like rehearsal. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." Silas had come to stand at the base of the porch steps. His face was the face he used when he had put everything he felt at a significant distance from his expression. Victoria looked from him to Eleanor and back. 14 days, she said. I will give you that before I file with the court. You may use that time to consider a voluntary arrangement, which will be considerably less difficult for everyone." She paused. "The alternative is that I make my argument to a judge in Colorado Springs, and I have made certain that argument is a thorough one." She smiled, then the brief mechanical smile of someone who has dispensed with the part of herself that generates warmth in the service of something she has decided is more important. "I look forward to discussing this further," she said. "I'll be at the hotel in Silverstone. You know where to find me." She went back to the carriage. The carriage turned and went back down the road. In the yard, Silas stood watching it go. Eleanor sat on the porch with her mending basket and watched him watch it. The mountains were enormous and entirely indifferent behind him, as they always were, as they would continue to be. She counted 14 days in her head. She heard the silence of the ranch around her, the horses in the paddock, the wind through the pines, the distant sound of Cole somewhere by the east fence, starting up one of his tuneless songs. She heard the solid reality of a home that had spent 5 months learning to breathe again. She set the mending basket down. She stood up from the chair. Whatever Victoria Hargrove had brought up that road in her expensive carriage, it was going to take everything this family had to meet it. Every plank of every bridge they had been quietly, carefully building these past months. Every morning that Gideon had come downstairs without being called. Every evening that Emmett had pressed his shoulder against hers. Every cup of coffee placed without comment at her usual spot at the table. Every step repaired before dawn. Every piece of sage placed beside a silver thimble on a window ledge by a man who did not have words for what he meant by it. It was all going to be tested now. She understood that as clearly as she understood anything. She went inside to start the evening meal. The 14 days began quietly. That was the thing about Victoria Hargrove that Eleanor came to understand in the first 48 hours after the carriage turned back down the ridge road. The woman did not storm. She did not make scenes. She understood with the precision of someone who had spent time thinking about how power works and what it requires, that the most effective kind of pressure is the kind that accumulates slowly, the kind that you feel building before you can point to anything specific that is causing it. On the first day, she appeared at the Sunday service at the Silverstone Church. She sat in a pew near the front and wore something in dark blue that was too well made for any pew in that building. And she spoke to people afterward in the yard with the practiced warmth of a woman who knows how to make strangers feel attended to. She asked after people's families. She expressed interest in the town. She was charming in the particular way of people who have decided to be charming for a purpose. And the town, which had not had a great deal of novelty, recently received her warmly. She mentioned her nephews, of course, how she had been thinking about them since Anne's passing, how the distance had made things difficult, how she had only recently been in a position to do something about what she felt was her responsibility to Anne's children. She did not say anything unkind about Eleanor or about Silas. She did not need to. She only had to describe the situation in plain factual terms, the marriage that had happened quickly and quietly, the school teacher who had been without employment, and let the people listening draw their own geometry. People are extremely capable of drawing their own geometry when the angles are arranged for them by someone who understands the work. On the third day, the quality of things in Silverstone had shifted. Eleanor felt it when she went in for flour. It was in the way conversations paused when she came near and resumed in a lower register. In the way the woman at the dry goods counter was careful to be helpful without being warm. In the way that Councilman Whitfield, who had always been apologetically decent toward her, found something requiring his attention in the direction of his boots when she passed him on the board sidewalk. She carried what she had purchased back to the wagon and loaded it with steady hands and drove home. Reed went into town on the 5th day. He did not explain this. He said at breakfast that he had business in Silverstone and would be back by mid-afternoon, and he went. He came back at mid-afternoon as stated, put his horse up, and came in for supper without any extended account of what he had done. Cole told her later, while they were working in the kitchen, that Reed had stood in the general store for 2 hours and spoken to everyone who came through the door. He had not been aggressive. He had not argued with anyone or raised his voice or made any kind of scene. He had simply been there, and he had said clearly and without editorial addition what he had observed in the months since Eleanor had come to Callaway Ridge. He described what she did, how she worked, how she handled the boys. He described specific instances, the practical and the particular. He did not use words like love or warmth or heart. He described what he had seen in the plain language of a man who trusts facts to carry their own weight if you stack them correctly. Then he had come home. Eleanor processed this information while she peeled potatoes. She thought about a man who had spent 5 months standing at a careful distance, watching and cataloging and withholding approval building his case the way a careful person builds any case from evidence. And she thought about what it meant that he had taken that case into Silverstone and laid it out in front of people who were being given a different version of events. It meant that he had finished building it, that he had arrived at a conclusion. She did not say anything to Reed about this. But at supper, she passed him the bread before he had to reach for it, and he took it and nodded once, and that was the full extent of the acknowledgement between them, which was exactly right. Silas had been meeting with his lawyer in Silverstone every few days since Victoria's arrival. He came back from these meetings quieter than he went, which was a meaningful thing to say about a man who was already constitutionally quiet. He brought his findings home in his expression rather than his words, and Eleanor had learned in these months to read him well enough to know the difference between the quiet of a man who is thinking through a problem and the quiet of a man who is losing ground. On the 9th day of the 14, he came back from Silverstone in the late afternoon and did not go to the barn. He came directly into the house through the kitchen and stopped in the doorway of the sitting room, where Eleanor was working through an arithmetic lesson with Emmett at the small table by the window. She looked up. He looked at her for a moment, then at Emmett. "You can finish that after supper," he told his younger son. Emmett collected his papers with the careful dignity of a 7-year-old and went upstairs. Silas came into the room. He sat down in the chair across from where she sat, and he placed on the table between them a folded piece of paper that had the particular worn quality of something that has been handled and refolded many times by someone working through a decision. "I need you to see this," he said. She unfolded it. It was a letter written in Silas's hand, which she recognized by now the way you recognize the handwriting of anyone you have lived closely with. The letter was addressed to Harmon Academy in Denver, inquiring about enrollment, terms fees, and availability for 2 students ages 9 and 7 for the coming academic year. The date on the letter was 7 months before Eleanor had come to Callaway Ridge. She read it through once. She folded it carefully and set it back on the table. "Victoria has this," she asked. "A copy. The Academy keeps records." Silence. "You were going to send them away." Eleanor said. "She said it the way you say a fact you are confirming, not the way you say a thing you are accusing someone of." "I was considering it." He looked at his hands, which were resting on his thighs, large and still and very deliberate about their stillness. "I had been considering it for several months. I did not know how to raise them the way they deserved. I did not know how to give them what they needed. I had tried hiring help, and it had not worked. I thought that perhaps there were people better equipped than I was to do what they required." "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality of something that has been kept in a closed space for a long time and is only now being let out. "I was standing at the yard gate, middle of the afternoon. I had made up my mind to send the inquiry and was preparing to have it taken to the post office. And I saw Gideon in the south paddock trying to teach Emmett to tie a blind knot. Emmett kept getting it wrong, coming apart each time. 6 times, 7 times. Gideon had every reason in the world to stop, to give up, to hand the rope back and walk away. He stopped. He didn't. He just kept at it, patiently, showing him again. And I stood at that gate and I thought, if I send them to Denver, he will never stand at this gate again and see this. I will never see whatever comes next." He looked at the letter on the table. "I never sent it," he said. But you need to say this to the judge, Eleanor said. I know. That letter on its own tells only one part of it. What you just told me is the part that matters. He nodded. He was looking at her now with those amber eyes, and there was something in them she had seen building gradually over these months. Like ice thawing, not dramatically, but progressively, 1 degree at a time until suddenly the water moves where before there was only stillness. I am concerned, he said, and he said it with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not make confessions easily, about what you think of me. Knowing this, she held his gaze. She did not look away from it. I think, she said, that you are a man who stood at a gate and watched his son refuse to give up on his brother and understood what that meant and changed course accordingly. She paused. That is not the behavior of a man who cannot raise his children. That is exactly the behavior of a man who can. Something moved across his face. Too controlled to be called relief, too genuine to be called anything else. He picked up the letter. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. My lawyer believes we can manage it, he said, and the case is not lost. He stood, but it is not simple. She watched him go back out through the kitchen. She heard him step down off the porch and cross the yard toward the barn. She sat in the sitting room in the afternoon light and thought about what she had just been given. Not the letter itself, but the fact of his bringing it to her. The fact that he had decided she was the person he needed to show it to before he could proceed. He had shared it with her, not with Reed, not with Cole, with her. This was the language she had been learning. This was a fluent sentence in it. On the 11th day, she found Gideon in the barn. It was the hour before supper, when the light inside the barn was honey-colored, and the shadows were long, and the horses were settled for the evening in the particular contentment of large animals at rest. She had come to check on the older mare, which had been favoring her left foreleg for 2 days. She nearly missed Gideon entirely because he was sitting in the corner of the empty stall at the far end in the shadow with his knees pulled up and his arms wrapped around them. She went to the mare first. She checked the leg pressed along the tendon, carefully noted that the swelling had reduced, and then she came and sat down on the floor of the empty stall across from Gideon. Not beside him. Across. She folded her coat under her and settled in without comment. The barn was full of his particular sounds, the shift and breath of horses, the occasional soft knock of a hoof against wood, the settling sounds of a structure that has been standing in this valley for many years and has made its peace with the weather. Gideon spoke after a while. If she wins, he said. Eleanor waited. If she wins, we have to go with her. That's what it means. That is what it would mean, Eleanor said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him in the dim light, the set of his jaw that was his father's jaw, the quality of his stillness that was also his father's, the particular weight of him sitting there that a 9-year-old should not have to carry, but sometimes does when the world has arranged things in a certain way. I don't want to go to Boston, he said. I know. This is my home. He said it without drama, without the performance of a child making an argument. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true, the way you state a fact of geography. Well, Emmett doesn't remember enough to know that. But I do. This is where everything is. This is where she is. He did not need to explain what he meant by she. Eleanor understood. You won't make us go if the judge says to, Gideon said. It was almost a question, almost but not quite. I would never stop fighting for you, she said. But I would not put you in the position of choosing between people who love you. That is not something a child should have to carry. He looked at her then, straight at her with those eyes that had spent 5 months learning whether she was worth looking at straight. I'm not choosing, he said. I already chose. She said nothing. She held the weight of what he had said and did not diminish it by responding too quickly. After a moment, he unfolded his arms and stretched his legs out in front of him, and some of the particular tension he had been carrying went out of his shoulders the way it goes out of a person who has said the thing they were holding and does not have to hold it alone anymore. They sat in the barn together until the light changed enough that it was time to go in for supper. On the 13th night, Eleanor woke at some point past midnight and lay still and listened to the house. She had developed in these months a nighttime awareness of Callaway Ridge that she had not had in her 2 years at the boarding house. This house made different sounds from the boarding house. It breathed differently. She had learned its creaks and its particular silences the way you learn a person's breathing when you have slept in a house with them long enough. What she heard was lamplight, not a sound exactly, but its absence was a sound. The absence of the darkness that should have been under the gap at the bottom of her door was replaced by a thin line of amber that meant a lamp was burning somewhere in the house at an hour when all lamps should have been out. She put on her coat and went into the hallway. The light was coming from the study. She knocked and then opened the door without waiting because at that hour in that house there was no practical reason to wait. Silas was at the desk. He was sitting in the way of a man who has been sitting there for some time with his coat still on over his night clothes, one lamp burning on the corner of the desk. In front of him lay an open document, several pages printed in the formal language of property and legal conveyance. She moved to where she could see it clearly. It was the deed to the southern pasture of Callaway Ridge. 400 acres of the best grazing land on the ranch, the lower section that caught the most reliable water and grew the most consistent grass, the section that any rancher would identify immediately as the heart of a cattle operation's value. Silas's signature was at the bottom, written in his careful, deliberate hand. He was looking at it the way you look at something you have decided and are not going to undecide. "This is for the court," he said. He did not look up. He knew she was there, and he spoke to her into the document at the same time the way a man speaks when he is saying something to himself as much as to anyone else. "I'm placing it as bond. If the court determines in the following year that I have been unfit in any regard, the land is forfeit." He paused. "It is the clearest thing I know how to say that I am certain." Eleanor came to stand beside the desk. She looked at the deed in the lamplight. "That land is the center of this operation," she said. "Yes. You could lose it." "I could." She looked at him. At the side of his face in the lamplight, at the chaw and the amber eyes looking at the document, at the hands that were resting on the desk beside it, large and still, and entirely resolved. "You didn't write a letter full of sentiment," she said carefully. "You didn't prepare a speech." "No. You went to the root cellar and found what you valued most and put it on the table." He looked up at her then. The amber eyes were very steady. "That is the only argument I know how to make," he said. "I do not have courtroom language. I have what I am willing to give up, and that is what I am willing to give up." She looked at the deed. She thought about what Anne's journal had said: he speaks by what he builds and what he gives up. She thought about repaired steps and fresh sage on a windowsill. She thought about 5 months of watching this man love the things he loved with every action and almost no words, and what this document sitting on this desk meant in that language. "The judge will understand it," she said. Silas looked back at the deed. He folded it carefully along its creases. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat. "Get some sleep," he said. "We leave at 6. The courthouse in Colorado Springs." She was back where she had started. The candle wax smell, the old wood, the hard benches, the 2 oil lamps that threw uneven shadows on the stone ceiling. She sat beside Silas at the table set aside for the respondents' party. Reed was in the first row behind them, straight-backed and still in his good coat, that he wore only for occasions requiring it. Cole was beside him, and beside Cole sat Emmett, who had dressed himself that morning with a care that was evident in the result and had asked Eleanor twice if his collar was straight. It was. Gideon sat beside Emmett. He sat as Silas sat, with his spine correct and his eyes forward and his hands resting on his thighs. And Eleanor thought, this is what 9 years of watching a father looks like when it has gone all the way through. Across the aisle, Victoria Hargrove sat with the composure of someone who has prepared very thoroughly for this room. Her attorney, a man named Devereaux, Boston trained, and based now in Denver, had a manner that managed to be both unhurried and relentlessly purposeful, the manner of a man who wins cases by making the other side feel that argument is beside the point. Judge Aldous Merritt took the bench at 9 in the morning. He was a man of 60 or thereabouts, with a white beard trimmed close and a face that had the look of a landscape that has been through enough weather to know which features are permanent and which are passing. He looked at the room over the tops of his reading glasses with the patient authority of a man who has sat in this chair for many years and arrived through that sitting at certain convictions about human beings. Victoria went first. Devereaux built the case methodically, the way you build a fence, one post and one rail at a time, never rushing at letting the structure accumulate its own persuasive weight. He described Victoria's connection to the boys, their aunt, their mother's sister family by blood and by love and by the terms of what family is supposed to mean. He described the home she could offer in Boston, the education, the social circumstances, the kind of life that Anne herself had come from before she had come west. He spoke about continuity, about what the boys had lost and what their aunt represented in the restoration of it. Then his tone shifted only slightly with the practiced calibration of a man who knows the value of understatement. He said that the marriage between Silas Calloway and the former Eleanor Whitmore had been arranged rapidly in circumstances that were difficult for both parties, and that while he made no accusations of malice, the court might reasonably wish to consider the context in which it had occurred. He said that a union formed from practical necessity was not the same as a union formed from love and commitment, and that children deserve the latter. Then he placed the letter on the judge's table. He read the essential portion of it aloud. The inquiry to Harmon Academy, the dates, the ages of the boys. The room held a breath. He said with the measured regret of a man who dislikes being forced by circumstances to be unkind. Even the respondent himself, in the months before this marriage was arranged, was not confident that he could provide what his sons required. This letter suggests that he was actively seeking to have them removed from his household and placed in the care of a formal institution. It would appear, Your Honor, that the marriage was in some sense an alternative to that arrangement, rather than a considered decision about what was best for these children. He sat down. The room breathed again in the way rooms breathe when something has landed precisely as intended. Silas's attorney did what he could. He was a local man named Garfield, older than Devereaux, and without Devereaux's particular ease in formal rooms, but he was thorough, and he was honest, and he had prepared well. He spoke about the ranch, about its stability, about the years of sound management that had built it. He spoke about the household, about the practical evidence of the boys' well-being. He called Eleanor's character and qualifications into the record. Then Garfield called Eleanor herself. She walked to the front of the room with her spine straight and her hands loose at her sides, the way her mother had taught her to walk when circumstances were being unkind. Devereaux took his turn first. His questions were clean and efficient. Why had she married Silas Calloway? What had she possessed before the marriage? What had she intended to gain from the arrangement? She answered every question directly and without apology. She had needed shelter. She had seen two boys who needed someone who would not leave. She had made a choice, and she had honored it every day since. Devereaux pressed, was it not true that the marriage had served her material interests precisely when she had no other options? She agreed that it had. She agreed also that she had spent 5 months in return doing something that had no material value whatsoever, that she had not been asked to do, and that she would do again without hesitation. Mrs. Calloway, Devereaux said, his tone shifting into something he clearly believed was a closing move. What exactly do you believe you have given these children? She looked at the judge rather than at the attorney. Their mother's song, she said, and back to them. In the dark, when it was needed. She returned to her seat. Devereaux answered each of Garfield's points with the smooth efficiency of someone who had anticipated every angle. The geometry of the morning was not moving in the right direction. Eleanor sat very still and watched and felt it. Then Silas stood up. He did not wait to be called. He stood, and Judge Merritt looked at him over the reading glasses with an expression that was not quite surprise. The expression of a man who has seen people rise unexpectedly in his courtroom before and has developed a policy of waiting to see what follows. Your Honor, Silas said, His voice in that room was what it was everywhere, low, measured, a voice that did not require the room to be quiet. It simply was, and the room quieted around it. I would like to address the court, if I may. The judge considered. Then he nodded. Silas straightened to his full height. He did not look at Devereaux. He did not look at Victoria. He looked at the judge the way he looked at the land when the land required understanding directly without mediation. I'm not a man with courtroom language, he said. I am a rancher. I speak by what I build and by what I am willing to put down. Today I am willing to put this down. He reached into his coat and removed the folded deed. He crossed to the judge's table and placed it there, not sliding it across, but setting it down with the deliberate care of a man making a transaction he intends to stand behind. Southern pasture of Callaway Ridge, 400 acres, the center of the operations value. I am placing it as bond for this court. If in the following 12 months any examination of my household determines that my sons are not being properly raised, that land is forfeit. He came back to his place and stood there and continued to look at the judge. That letter was written, he said. I wrote it. I considered sending my sons away because I did not know how to give them what they needed, and I was afraid of doing it wrong. I did not send them. I did not send them because I stood at the gate one afternoon and watched my older boy spend an hour teaching his little brother to tie a knot patient and steady and refusing to quit, and I understood that those two boys belonged where they were. Whatever I could not give them myself, I was going to find a way to provide. Whatever I lacked, I was going to address. The letter exists. My decision not to act on it also exists. A man should be measured by what he decided, not only by what he considered. He paused. I married Eleanor Whitmore because I needed help, and she was the right person to give it. That is true. It is also true that she has spent the last 5 months giving that help in every form it was needed, without anyone asking her to go further than her original agreement and without her ever stopping at the boundary of it. She has mothered my sons, not in the performance of it, in the doing of it, every morning and every evening and in the middle of the night during storms. He stopped. He looked at Eleanor briefly, a look that lasted less than a second and contained the compressed weight of 5 months. Then he sat down. The room was very quiet. Devereaux was preparing his response, his pen already moving in the notes before him, when a sound occurred on the benches behind the respondent's table. The sound of a child getting to his feet. Gideon had stood up. He had not raised his hand. He had not looked at anyone for permission. He had simply stood in the way of a person who has identified the precise moment when staying in their seat is no longer possible. Judge Merritt looked at him. Sir, Gideon said. He addressed the judge as sir because he did not know the formal term for what judges were called, and sir was the most respectful word in his vocabulary, and he wanted to be respectful. May I speak? There was a brief stillness in the room that was itself a kind of conversation. Then Aldous Merritt, who had been a judge for 22 years and had in that time developed a reliable instinct for the moments that mattered and the ones that did not, removed his glasses and set them on the desk. Come forward, he said. Gideon walked to the front of the room. He stood where he could be seen by everyone, which was everyone except Emmett, who had slipped off his bench and was now standing in the aisle holding Cole's hand, which Cole had offered without a word. Gideon stood the way his father stood, back straight, hands at his sides, eyes forward. The difference between them in that posture was that Silas had arrived at that stance through years, and Gideon was operating from some other source of it, from something he had inherited before he had the context to understand it. He looked at Judge Merritt, and he spoke. My aunt says she wants what is best for us, he said. She says that is why she is here. He was not quite steady, but he did not stop for it. She was not there when Emmett was sick and crying all night during the flood storm, and the only person who sat with him until he stopped was Miss Eleanor. She was not there when my father was at the river with the hands, and we did not know if he was coming home, and Miss Eleanor stayed awake until he came through the door. She was not there for any of it. She was in Boston. He swallowed. Miss Eleanor has been there for all of it. Then he said the thing he had not told anyone. He said it looking at the judge, but he said it in the particular way of someone who is really saying it to a room, the way a statement escapes its intended recipient and belongs to the air instead. One afternoon, I came downstairs and found her in the sitting room. She had Mama's journal. She had found it in the storage shelf. He stopped. He breathed in once. She was reading it. She did not know I was there. She was crying. He looked at the judge steadily. Not a little. She was crying in the quiet way that people cry when they think no one can see them. Because of words my mother had written. About a woman she never met. The room was absolutely silent. Someone who only came for the money or the house, Gideon said, does not cry over the diary of a woman they never met. They do not cry for someone who cannot give them anything back. He paused. She honored my mother. She kept her. She learned Emmett's storm song, and she sang it to him in the dark until he slept. And she learned it the same night she heard it because she paid attention to the right things. He stopped speaking. He turned and walked back to his seat. The silence in the room lasted long enough to become its own kind of verdict. Then Emmett's voice came from the aisle, small and clear and entirely without theater. She sings in storms, he said. Cole's hand tightened on his. Emmett did not elaborate. He did not need to. He had said the thing that was true in the fewest words required to say it, and that was enough. Judge Aldous Merritt replaced his reading glasses. He looked at his desk. He looked at the deed sitting there. He looked at the courtroom. He looked for a long moment at the two boys who had moved back to their bench and were sitting close together, Gideon, with one hand braced on the bench in the manner of someone who has done something difficult and is managing the aftermath of it, Emmett pressing his side against his brother's arm in the way of someone who knows that is where he belongs. I have heard sufficient testimony, the judge said. Devereaux began to rise. The judge looked at him briefly and he stopped rising. The court finds no evidence of neglect. The court finds no evidence of an unstable environment. What the court does find is evidence of two children who know where their home is and have demonstrated in this room the kind of clarity about that which does not come from comfortable circumstance. He looked at Silas. The bond is accepted by the court and will be noted in the record. He looked at Victoria Hargrove. The petition is denied. The boys remain in their father's custody. He picked up his gavel. This matter is closed. The gavel came down. Victoria was very still for a moment. Then she gathered her things with the careful composure of a woman who was not going to be seen losing in a way that could be described later. She stood. She looked at Silas across the room, and her expression held something that was not simply anger and not simply grief, something more complicated than either the expression of someone who has been completely certain of their own rightness and has been told by a formal proceeding that they were wrong. This was not what Anne would have wanted, she said. Silas looked at her. You did not know Anne the way I did, he said. He said it without particular coldness. He said it as a fact he was certain of. If you had, you would know that what she wanted for her boys was a home where someone paid attention to them and did not leave when it got difficult. We have that. He held her gaze for a moment. I am sorry it has to end this way between us. I truly am. Victoria's jaw tightened. She said nothing more. She walked out of the courtroom with her attorney, and the door closed behind them, and it closed with a finality that had the quality of something genuinely finished. Outside on the courthouse steps, Cole let out a long exhale that he had clearly been holding since approximately the moment Gideon had stood up. 400 acres, he said to Silas, shaking his head with the affectionate exasperation of a younger brother. You couldn't have offered 300. Silas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. No, he said. Reed stood slightly apart from the group, as he generally did, looking at the street. Then he looked at Emmett, who was watching him. Good work, Reed said to Emmett. Emmett considered this. Then he nodded with the gravity of someone receiving professional recognition. On the road back to Callaway Ridge, the boys fell asleep in the back of the wagon before they reached the edge of town, Emmett against Gideon's shoulder, and Gideon not moving an inch for the entire ride so as not to disturb him. Cole drove. Reed sat beside him, as was his habit. Silas sat in the back beside Eleanor, not speaking, watching the country they passed through with the expression of a man who has set something down after carrying it for a long time and is learning what his body feels like without the weight. The mountains went past them in their unhurried way. The light changed on the granite faces as the afternoon moved. The pines stood in their long rows, their shadows going east now, with the sun going west, and the whole country had the quality of a thing that was entirely itself indifferent to what had just been settled in a stone building in a city at the edge of the mountains. Eleanor watched the mountains go past. She thought about the question she had asked herself in that courthouse room on an April morning. Did she belong to this family? She was beginning to have an answer. That evening, after the boys were in bed, and Cole had taken himself out to the barn for the ritual of checking on the horses that he performed every night before sleep, and Reed had gone to his room at the far end of the house, the kitchen was quiet, in the way that kitchens are quiet when the activity of the day has finished, and what remains is only the quality of the day itself settling. Eleanor washed the supper dishes. The window above the sink was dark, the mountains invisible now, behind it only the occasional movement of wind-driven cloud crossing the stars. She heard Silas behind her. Not his footsteps exactly. She was past the point of requiring footsteps to know when he entered a room. She turned. He was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. His coat was off. He had the look of a man who has been sitting somewhere for an hour, not doing anything except sitting, which was for him an unusual activity and one that suggested something was working its way toward the surface. He crossed to the window. He picked up the silver thimble from its place on the ledge above the sink. He turned it in his fingers the way she had seen him turn his coffee cup, not restlessly, but with the attention of a man who is feeling something through his hands that he cannot feel another way. Then he held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. When Anne passed, he said, "I put this here because I did not know what else to do with it. I could not put it in the room. I could not put it in a box. It needed to be somewhere it could be seen." He paused. "You have been looking at it for 5 months." She had. "You have not touched it," he said. "It wasn't mine to touch." He looked at the thimble in his hand for a moment. "She would have liked you," he said. "I have thought about this a great deal. She would have found you. She had that quality of finding the person in a room who was worth finding." He was very quiet for a moment. "She would have liked that you cried over her journal. Not because she wanted to be mourned, because it would have told her what it told Gideon, that you pay attention to the right things." Eleanor was very still. "I have spent 3 years," Silas said, "not knowing how to do this, not knowing how to live in this house without her in it, not knowing how to speak to my sons about what we lost, not knowing how to do any of it." He looked at her. The amber eyes in the lamplight were tired and present, and entirely without the distance that had been there 5 months ago in a boarding house hallway when he had said things that needed to be said, but did not yet know how to say anything else. And then you came, and you did not fix it. Nothing can fix it. But you gave us somewhere to put it. You gave us a way to go on. He set the thimble in her palm. His hand was warm from holding it. She closed her fingers around it. "I love you," he said. 3 words simple, without decoration. "I did not expect to. That is the truth of it. I came to your door with a practical problem and a practical solution, and somewhere between then and now something happened that was not practical at all, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." A pause. "I am not a man of many words. You know this by now, but this is a thing I needed to say with words because I think some things require them." She held the thimble. She felt the weight of it, the smoothness of the silver worn by years of a hand that was not hers and would never be hers, and yet somehow, transferred somehow, continuous. "I love you," she said, "in this family." She held his gaze. "I came here looking for a roof over my head. I did not expect any of the rest of it, but here we are." He reached up and touched her face briefly, in the way of a man who has not practiced at gestures of tenderness, but has decided that this one is required. His hand was large and rough and careful. Then he went out to check the barn because this was a thing he did every evening, and the fact of the evening they had just had did not alter the structure of what the ranch required. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window with Anne's thimble in her hand, and she looked out into the dark where the mountains were, and she thought about a woman who had sat at a fence line and felt that time was not running out. She thought about a journal left on a shelf and a melody hummed by a feverish child in a storm. She thought about a porch step fixed before dawn and dried sage on a windowsill and a deed laid on a judge's desk with the calm certainty of a man who speaks through what he is willing to lose. She put the thimble in her dress pocket. She finished washing the dishes. A summer morning 14 months later. Callaway Ridge on a clear Colorado morning in the high summer of 1875 was a particular kind of beautiful, the kind that happens when a landscape is entirely what it is and has been what it is long enough to have arrived at a settled relationship with itself. The mountains ran along the western edge of the sky in their unhurried way. The meadow grass was green and long and moved in the warm air. The horses in the south paddock moved slowly in the morning, grazing with a profound contentment of horses that have been well kept and know it. The linen curtains in the sitting room window were new, Blue Eleanor's choice put up in the fall after the hearing. No one had commented on them directly, which was the household's way of approving of things they had not ordered, but found they preferred. The bookshelf below the staircase had been reorganized. The account ledgers were still there, but they shared the shelves now with novels and an atlas and a collection of natural history books that had come from a catalog and had been ordered by Eleanor on the grounds that Gideon had expressed interest in the geology of the mountains and deserved the material to pursue it. The catalog books had been shelved without comment by Silas in the same way the curtains had been hung, which was the form that acceptance took in this particular house. Gideon Callaway was 10 now, almost 11. He had gained a full 2 inches in the past year and was beginning to carry his frame with the natural authority of someone growing into it. He was out with Silas most mornings by the time Eleanor came downstairs, learning the fence lines and the water management and the cattle counting and everything else that the running of Callaway Ridge required of the person who would one day run it. He came in for meals with the smell of horses and grass in him and ate with the appetite of someone who has been doing real work. He still stood, sometimes at the fence line in the late afternoon. She still went and stood beside him, sometimes 2 feet of fence rail between them, and they looked at the valley together without explaining what they were doing. Emmett was 8. He had recently discovered that books could be funny, a revelation that had been received by the household as a mostly positive development, with the caveat from Reed that it was affecting his table manners. Emmett had acknowledged this concern with the seriousness it did not deserve and had continued exactly as before. He braided his own hair in the mornings, now imperfectly with determination. He sang the storm song to himself sometimes when he thought no one was listening. Eleanor never told him she could hear it. Reed Callaway had developed a habit of stopping in the kitchen in the mornings before going out, which was new, and which he had never explained. He poured his coffee, he said good morning, he reported any relevant information about weather or livestock or the needs of the day. Then he went out. It was a 5-minute exchange, unremarkable in every way except that it had not existed before, and its existence was its own kind of statement. Cole continued to be Cole. He helped in the kitchen whenever he felt moved to do so, and sang to the horses and made very bad jokes at breakfast that made Emmett laugh and made Gideon try very hard not to laugh, which was almost as good. He had a gift for making a house feel like what it was supposed to feel like, not through any single action, but through the cumulative quality of his presence, warm and steady, and taking up exactly his allotted portion of the world without excess. The locked room at the end of the hall remained locked. Eleanor had never tried the handle. She had no intention of doing so. Some rooms are not locked because of what is in them. They are locked because the person who locked them has not yet found the morning when unlocking them is the right thing to do. When that morning came, she would know. Until then, the door stayed closed, and that was entirely acceptable to her. On a July morning, sitting at the kitchen table after Silas had gone out, and before the boys had come down, Eleanor turned the silver thimble over in her fingers. She did this sometimes when the house was quiet, the way you handle a stone you have carried long enough that it has warmed to your temperature. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1873, when she had stood in a classroom and erased the alphabet from a blackboard and thought it was the end of something. It had been, and it had not been. Both things were true the way two things can both be true when the thing that ends is also the thing that permits the beginning of something else. She heard Silas's boots on the porch steps. The door opened. He came through the kitchen on his way to the pantry, hat in hand, the smell of the morning on his coat. He paused beside her table. He looked at her with those amber eyes, unhurried, in the way of a man who has arrived at the understanding that the person in front of him is not going anywhere, and therefore the moment can be given its proper length. He said nothing. She said nothing. He reached across and poured himself the last of the coffee from the pot on the stove. And then he went about his morning, and Eleanor sat at the table with the thimble warm in her palm and listened to the sounds of the house she lived in. Emmett's feet on the floor above, Gideon's voice somewhere at the barn, the horses in the paddock. Reed's deliberate step on the porch. Cole beginning one of his formless songs somewhere in the direction of the woodshed. The mountains outside the window were what they had always been, patient, enormous, entirely indifferent to everything that was not the essential nature of things. Inside Callaway Ridge, something that had been very still for a very long time was in motion again. She put the thimble in her pocket. She stood up to start breakfast.